Scott is here to talk about this important new work, South Korea at a Crossroads. And it is indeed a book that not only will concern and inform Korea watchers, but I think those of us who are interested in the dynamics of Asia and Asia-U.S. relations writ large. But it is singularly important in terms of expressing where South Korea sits, the options it has available, the endurance of the ROK-US alliance, the offerings and the difficulties and contest and challenge of dealing with China. And it gives us a great modern historical overview for those of you who are fans of modern diplomatic history of where Korea has sat and all important periods, in particular those that followed the Seoul Summer Games and the transition to democracy and what that has meant in a new era. But Scott takes us very much up to date and gives us a great deal to think about in terms of where Seoul sits today. Also, I just wanted to say that, of the individuals who make a contribution in our field, I'm no prouder than to interview Scott or to welcome Scott, because Scott has really, I think, been a person of great humility as well as a person of great content. And I know all of us in the Korean Studies field value him as a thought leader in the field, or as Kurt Campbell says on the back of that book jacket, the preeminent Korea watcher. So Scott Snyder, thank you, welcome, and what a wonderful book you've given us.
Well, thank you, Steve, for really very kind and personal introduction. And it's really a great pleasure for me to be here at the Korea Society. The Korea Society has been very supportive of my work in the past, including some of the previous books that I've been involved with either co-writing or editing. And so it's a real pleasure to be back here in the new quarters. And I tried in this book, South Korea at the Crossroads, really to dig into the determinants behind South Korean strategic choices. And we all know the difficult circumstances that South Korea faces, geographically and geopolitically, facing a North Korean nuclear threat, caught between the U.S. and China, and even ducking in the war of words between Kim Jong-un and President Trump. South Korea really has an extraordinary set of diplomatic challenges that it faces. And so I really wanted to try to dig into, well, what are the factors behind the choices that the South Korean government has made? Strategic choices. And basically what I was hoping is that by examining those determinants of South Korean strategic choices, it would really help me and others to understand where South Korea might go in the future and how it would try to get there. And then in the process of doing that, I ended up having to go back and review the evolution of South Korea's foreign policy since the founding of the Republic of Korea in 1948. And so I ended up with essentially a kind of a modern diplomatic history of South Korea. But the core driver in terms of my interest in writing the book really focused on the question of how is South Korea grappling with some of the critical and ongoing foreign policy debates that are going on in Seoul and have been going on over the course of the past few years and are likely to continue. And so there are really three ongoing debates in South Korean foreign policy that I think are most relevant to South Korean strategic decision-making. I have chapters on each of those in the book. And I kind of want to lay out those three critical debates as I see them and then dig into just one of them. And so the first debate is really over South Korea's role, opportunities, and options as a middle power that now has the ability to shape its own environment, but also finds itself trapped geopolitically among larger neighbors. And so that's really, I think, encapsulated in this paradox between South Korea's increasing global role, as we're going to see over the course of the next few weeks, including as what I'm sure will be a consummate host for the world as part of the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, but also facing these geopolitical constraints related to the challenge of dealing with North Korea. And really, I think the critical issue there, in some ways, goes back to the question of how can South Korea break out of its historical victim role in the context of major power confrontation in Northeast Asia? Are there new tools in South Korea's diplomatic arsenal that can be used in order to break out of what Mearsheimer called the tragedy of great power politics? And then a second debate that I deal with in the book is related to how South Korea maneuvers between its largest economic partner, China, and its longstanding security patron, the United States. And I try to dig into, well, what are the various options, strategic options that South Korea can use as part of the challenge of trying to maneuver between the U.S. And China. And then the third debate, I think, is really the long-standing debate over Korean unification. And that debate, the issue of foreign policy and the challenge of being a divided state and wanting to achieve unification on the peninsula is clearly a subject that has preoccupied South Korean foreign policy and has influenced South Korean foreign policy in some pretty dramatic ways. And so I really want to dig in tonight into that third debate primarily. It's the one that I think is on the minds of most people as we look at rising tensions, especially between the U.S. and North Korea, as we look at the Moon administration's efforts to try to maneuver really between the U.S. and North Korea, especially in the context of the next few weeks as they host the Olympics and as they look for a way to forestall potential trajectory toward confrontation. And so that's the one I think is really, in a way, the most interesting and relevant to today's situation. And I think one way of kind of digging into that particular debate is really just to focus on the Demilitarized Zone and the Joint Security Area as the symbol of Korea's dividedness and as kind of the physical evidence of the challenge of dealing with North Korea. And over the course of the past few weeks, the Demilitarized Zone and the Joint Security Area have come into focus in some very interesting ways. And of course, we all know if you go to the Joint Security Area of the DMZ, you're driven up to the DMZ, you park behind a building called the Freedom House, which is on the southern side of the dividing line. And that building is next to the Peace House, where we just recently saw the inter-Korean negotiations, the first one in almost 3 years, that led to North Korea's participation in the Olympics. And then as you walk to the front of the Freedom House, you see the three corrugated metal buildings that straddle the dividing line between North and South Korea, and tourists are allowed to go into the middle one where the armistice was actually negotiated in order to kind of experience being on the North Korean side of the line. It's very interesting. When I was watching several weeks ago the North Korean negotiating delegation coming down, we saw the North Korean negotiator and his team crossing the demilitarized zone from the north side. The South Koreans, I think, actually took the delegation through the Freedom House in order to get to the Peace House. And of course, we saw that the North Korean lead negotiator didn't have a coat on, even though it was pretty cold. But right there, we had a historic interaction, the first of its type under the Moon administration. And of course, also the Joint Security Area was the scene of the dramatic escape of the North Korean soldier just a few months ago, who drove his Jeep from the west toward the DMZ, kind of crashed his vehicle and then came across and was rescued by South Korean soldiers and medevaced to a hospital in the south where his wounds were treated. But what I really think is most interesting about the Joint Security Area, the story that I kind of want to focus on, is related to some friends of mine, professor and his family. Usually foreigners are the ones who take that tour to the Joint Security Area. But in this particular case, a professor friend of mine went with his parents and with his children. And he told me a few years ago about his experience. And I think it was quite telling because as he and his family walked through the Freedom House and looked onto North Korea, his parents were so fearful they almost didn't want to come out. They, of course, had direct memories of the impact of the Korean War. And so the idea of even looking across into North Korea was unsettling for them. For the professor and his wife, the experience was a kind of reflective experience. It was a very serious, somber, place of reflection about the cost of division and the impact and consequences of the war and then the divided peninsula. And for his kids, as you can imagine, it was kind of like another amusement park, not necessarily any real historical significance. It was just another place that they couldn't necessarily absorb the historic significance. And the reason why I share that story is because I think that it provides a kind of picture of generational change in Korea and the evolution of attitudes on the issue of Korean unification. And then if we go back and look at South Korean debates over how to achieve unification, what are the South Korean strategies for achieving unification, we all know that essentially the South Korean political scene is divided almost right down the middle between conservatives on the one hand and progressives on the other. And if we look at the debate and its evolution over the course of the past 30 years, I think that there are two particular instances on the conservative side where there was the perception that their vision of unification might be within grasp, and two examples on the progressive side where their vision of a gradual unification that would result in a kind of united brotherhood could plausibly have been grasped. And so I thought I might just recap those particular debates. Many of you will be familiar with these, but in terms of the gradualist approach to a negotiated unification, I actually think that the first moment of significance came in the context of South Korea's democratic transition back in 1988 and 1989 when the No Tae-woo administration pursued what was called Nordpolitik. And of course, we saw German unification with the end of the Cold War. We saw a South Korean government looking to that German experience of unification by absorption, but actually pursuing a policy at the end of the Cold War that involved an emphasis on dialogue and on opening new relationships. And of course, the first component of that opening was related to opening to the former Eastern Bloc countries and really was facilitated by the Seoul Olympics 30 years ago. And we saw South Korea normalizing relations with Russia and with Soviet Union and with China. But we all know that for Noteu, the path to Pyongyang was designed to lead through Beijing and through Moscow. And in fact, we saw really the first, I think, in a way, the most significant breakthrough in terms of inter-Korean negotiation at that time. The Agreement on Reconciliation, Non-Aggression, Exchanges, and Cooperation. And that agreement is now old. It was made in 1992. If you go back and look at it, I think it contains actually all the elements in terms of confidence building, a gradual process, cooperatively unfolding between North and South Korea, involving exchanges, cooperation, confidence building measures, military tension reduction. In terms of that framework that they called the basic agreement, it's all there. But of course, what happened was the first North Korean nuclear crisis and the U.S. concern about North Korea developing nuclear weapons, or actually the reactor at Yongbyon back in the early 1990s following the first Persian Gulf War. And that, I think, focus on North Korea as a potential violator on the nuclear front, concerns about North Korean nuclear proliferation really interrupted that process between the two Koreas at a very early stage. So the second moment that I want to bring you to occurred only a few years later under Noteu's successor, Kim Young-sam, and I'm sure that many will remember there was a phrase after Kim Il-sung's death with rumors of the outbreak of famine in North Korea, subsequently confirmed in very real humanitarian refugee flows from North Korea. They started in the Kim Young-sam government to talk about whether or not there might be a quote-unquote hard landing in North Korea. And at that time, I think that under Kim Young-sam, there was an interest in trying to pursue a kind of unification by absorption that would come as a result of the collapse of North Korea. But of course, the situation was a little bit surprising. There was a humanitarian crisis, but it was accompanied by continued political control. We know that at that time, aid organizations, ended up working with the North Korean public distribution system to some degree because they were used to working in situations where there was a complete absence of government, and this provided a very efficient means by which to distribute food internally to North Korea. But of course, the hard landing did not come at that time. North Korea continued. And instead, what we saw was a financial crisis in South Korea, the Asian financial crisis in 1997, that really precipitated the election of Kim Dae-jung, who, of course, created the second progressive moment in terms of a pathway toward unification. And that was under the rubric of what was called the Sunshine Policy, a policy that was designed to, is really designed to try to use economic incentives as a way to generate political change inside North Korea. And so at that time, the Kim Dae-jung administration talked about the separation of economics and politics. It tried to use economic engagement with North Korea as a way of promoting changes. We saw the Mount Kumgang tourist zone at that time. We saw the establishment of the plans for the Kaesong industrial complex. And we really saw a pretty concerted effort under Kim Dae-jung and under his successor, Roh Moo-hyun, to try to use economic instruments to try to bring about change in North Korea. But of course, in some ways, instead of being, and we saw the Inter-Korean Summit in the year 2000. But of course, instead of being a catalyst for changing North Korea, in some ways it felt like the Sunshine Policy generated changes in South Korea, and it generated divisions politically, internally within South Korea over how to deal with North Korea. And because the North Koreans were willing to accept aid from South Korea and accept people from South Korea, but did not reciprocate in terms of sending their own people to South Korea, we saw what some people at that time called one-sided love, and we essentially saw a fatigue in South Korea with continued giving that eventually, I think, showed itself in the return to power of conservatives, initially under Lee Myung-bak and then subsequently under Park Geun-hye. And so that brings me to the fourth moment, the conservative moment in terms of thinking about, again, a unification by absorption. And I think that is best epitomized under the conservatives by Park Geun-hye's idea of a unification jackpot, the idea that somehow unification was going to occur soon. Again, this was just after Kim Jong-il passed away, and there is a new untested Kim Jong-un coming to power, but not yet consolidated. And we saw the establishment of a presidential committee for the preparation of Korean unification. But of course, what happened? Well, Park Geun-hye was removed, she was impeached, but Kim Jong-un is still there. And so thus the demise of the fourth effort, I think, historically. So there's been no shortage of progressive and conservative effort and ideas about how to achieve Korean unification. Obviously, it has not occurred. And I think that it really just makes more resonant, in my mind, the words of a former South Korean unification minister who said that actually unification is not something that we can reach out and grasp. It is something that will come to us. And so I think that it actually ends up being the irony and the dilemma as we think about South Korea's strategies towards unification, and that is that ultimately the prospects and possibilities for unification depend on choices that are made in North Korea, not on strategies that are made in South Korea. And I would argue that there are two fundamental North Korean choices influencing the nature and prospects for Korean unification. One is related to North Korean economic policies, and there it's whether or not North Korea embraces autarky or economic reform. And the second involves North Korean political policies toward the South, whether North Korea maintains an attitude of hostility or friendship towards South Korea. And in my book, I go into some pretty some detail about how that might play out. But the short version is really that a North Korea that is autarkic and hostile remains a clear and present danger to South Korean security. A North Korea that is autarkic but not hostile would allow South Korea to achieve the essential objective of peaceful coexistence that would reduce North Korea as a threat to South Korean security. In some ways, this is what I think the Sunshine Policy approach was premised on. And then a North Korea that is reformist and friendly is actually the prerequisite for gradual unification scenario that is most appealing to South Korea, and that would lead not only to peaceful unification, but would enable enhanced cooperation that might someday make a political integration process feasible. And that's actually what the Sunshine Policy was about. And then beyond these choices by the North Korean leadership, there's also a choice set that would be generated in the event of North Korean internal instability. And there I would focus on the pace and nature of instability in North Korea if it were to occur. The question of North Korean instability becomes more important if indeed North Korea continues to resist denuclearization negotiations and if the U.S.-led international pressure campaign in response to North Korea's nuclear development continues. And so, in a way, we're at a very interesting kind of inflection point in terms of some of the analysis about what possible pathways might occur, both because of the maximum pressure campaign, which is designed to use economic pressure to force Kim Jong-un to change direction, and in terms of this apparent opening between North and South Korea, which invites the possibility, at least for the moment, of inter-Korean friendship rather than inter-Korean animosity. And we'll have to sort of see how that plays out. But just to conclude, I want to go back to my Korean friend's family experience right there at the Joint Security Area, because generational change is changing expectations and the intensity of desire for Korean unification as a strategic objective on both sides of the DMZ. And it's putting new pressures on governments as public opinion changes. And I think that that is most clearly shown in the recent response, especially among young people in South Korea, to the idea of a unified women's ice hockey team. And the fact that that appears to have had a role in declining public support for President Moon, even as he has taken steps that are likely to help ensure the near-term peaceful holding of the Olympics that we're going to see over the course of the next few weeks.
Great, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Snyder. Round of applause, please, for Scott. We would encourage you, please do visit Amazon or your bookseller and pick this up, and I think you'll find it extremely engaging. I am proud to say that our Columbia University graduate class at SEPA was among, I think, the first 30 orders of this book, and it will be used widely at universities, but I think it will enjoy a great popular readership, and I think it's no exaggeration to say that it may be the most important major book on Korea since Don Oberdorfer's and now Bob Carlin's update on the two Koreas. And so, Scott, wonderfully done. Congratulations. I'd also like to extend special thanks to our staff here. Jonathan Corrado, our Associate Director for Policy, who does all the logistics for these types of programs. Also Peter Stemke, who runs our audio and video, and this will be turned around rapidly, and you'll be able to get it in the morning on both audio and video format. Angela Rhee in the back of the room, Jane Kim, and especially to our board of director members, YD Kim, who's our senior board member here. Thank you, YD. To Phil Sherman, thank you very much for coming, Phil, and to our other generous contributors. I know both Julia Quincy and Sonia Bachman here in the room have both written very generous checks in support of our effort here on policy. So thank you very much for what you do, and thank you, friends, for coming and visiting us. I would enjoy seeing you back next week if you have the availability to enjoy some of our Olympic analysis at 9 a.m. on Wednesday in our executive boardroom. We'll be having a small session. Scott will call in, and we will be discussing some of the Olympics aspects 2 days before the opening and on the morning of the opening of the Olympic Games on February 9th. On Friday, we will have an 8 to 10 a.m. breakfast. So come enjoy breakfast at Pyeongchang at the Korea Society. And during the entirety of the games, we will have it streaming here on screen. And if you are at home, you can see that at NBCOlympics.com. So thank you very much for supporting the Korea Society, and please do fill out our evaluations. For information on membership, please see the pamphlets at the back of the room or visit us at koreasociety.org. And again, a round of applause for Scott Snyder. Thank you, Scott.